The image of the swelling would not leave her thoughts even as she documented the final stages of the human stabilization. The monitors pulsed with steady rhythms. The patient's vitals remained strong, and by all accounts her work had been successful. Yet her mind circled back again and again to the anomaly, to the unanswered questions left in its wake. Pride told her she had done her duty, that she had maintained composure and preserved life. But curiosity whispered louder, insisting that she had witnessed something far more important than the injury itself. The human's body had revealed a truth not yet known to the Concorde, a truth that refused to be tamed by protocol or databanks. That realization lingered with her, settling deeper than any case she had treated before. When her shift ended and she retired to the quiet of her quarters, the memory still burned in her. She replayed it in her mind's eye with the precision of a medic reviewing procedure, noting every flicker of vascular change, every shift in tissue density, every subtle tremor of surrounding musculature. Yet beyond the sterile details, she also remembered the sense of shock that had struck her, shock she had never admitted to anyone. It had been small, fleeting, invisible to her colleagues, but undeniable within her. The swelling had done what plasma burns and shattered bones never could. It had shaken her, and that, more than the biology itself, left the deepest impression. Her pride had always rested on the belief that she was unshakable, but here was proof that even she could falter when faced with the unknown. That falter was not a weakness, she realized slowly, but a revelation. To be shaken was to recognize the boundaries of her knowledge. To feel that jolt was to stand at the edge of discovery. Humans had brought her to that edge, not with violence or catastrophe, but with a reflex so ordinary for them it did not merit explanation. That was the power of this species. They carried within their fragile forms surprises vast enough to humble the proudest medic of the Concorde. She considered the implications beyond herself. If a simple physiological reaction could so thoroughly confound her, what other mysteries might human bodies conceal? What hidden adaptations, what uncharted instincts, what strange survivals? The swelling was not just an isolated puzzle, it was a symbol of the species' unpredictability. It meant that every assumption the Concorde had made about humans might crumble under closer examination. And if their biology resisted easy categorization, what of their minds, their cultures, their ambitions? The thought unsettled her and thrilled her at once. She turned to her private log, scrolling through the meticulous notes she had taken. Each line of data glowed on her display, raw observations without interpretation. She read them like scripture, as though meaning might emerge through repetition. She imagined future medics reading the same lines, perhaps finding in them the first step toward a broader understanding of humanity. The idea that her private struggle could one day shape galactic medicine filled her with a sense of gravity unlike anything she had known before. She was no longer merely a caretaker of patients. She was a witness to the frontier of knowledge itself. Still, the personal impression would not fade. The swelling had not been grotesque, not horrifying, not deadly. Yet it had provoked a reaction in her unlike any battlefield wound. It had reminded her that life could not be reduced to neat entries in a database, that biology was more than predictable patterns. Humans, she now understood, embodied that truth in every cell. They thrived not because they were the strongest or most efficient, but because they were unpredictable, filled with redundancies and reflexes that defied expectation. She had seen the living proof of that in her patient, and it had marked her more deeply than she wished to admit. Even in her solitude, she replayed the tension she had felt in the medbay, the balance between protocol and curiosity. She recognized now that curiosity had won, not in reckless action, but in the way it left its mark on her. The swelling had carved a place in her thoughts that protocol could never erase. It had taught her something about herself, as well as about humans. She was not the unshakable machine her colleagues believed her to be. She was a being who could be surprised, who could be humbled, who could learn. And she found, to her surprise, that she did not resent that revelation. She welcomed it. She began to imagine what it would mean to treat more humans, to study them not as curiosities, but as patients whose very biology demanded respect. The swelling had been shocking because it was unexpected, but with time she knew she could learn its meaning. And with each discovery, her composure would grow not from ignorance of surprise, but from familiarity with it. That was the deeper lesson she carried away. True steadiness did not come from never being shaken, but from learning to integrate the shock into one's understanding. Humans had forced her into that lesson, and she would not forget it. In the days that followed, she found herself speaking differently about her work. When colleagues asked about the new species, she no longer repeated the standard phrases about adaptability and resilience. Instead, she spoke of mystery, of potential, of the need to approach humans with humility, as well as professionalism. She saw the puzzled looks on their faces, the doubt in their eyes, but she did not mind. They had not stood where she had stood. They had not seen what she had seen. To them, humans were still abstractions, To her, they were a reality that had reached past her pride and left an imprint she could not deny. The swelling itself faded from her patient's body as he stabilized, leaving no trace for others to witness. But for Jialten, it had not faded at all. It lived in her memory, a constant reminder that her pride and composure must now share space with awe. Where once she believed herself invulnerable to shock, she now carried proof that the universe could still surprise her. And she recognized that this surprise was not a threat to her identity, but a deepening of it. To be shaken was to grow, and to grow was to serve her patients better. Thus, the human's body had taught her more than any academy, more than any battlefield. It had shown her that humanity's uniqueness lay not only in survival, but in the way they forced others to confront their own limitations. She would never look at her work the same way again. Every patient, human or otherwise, might carry within them an unknown waiting to be revealed. But humans, she suspected, would carry more unknowns than most. That was their gift, their danger, their lasting impression. On the medical frigate Vaithra, Nurse Jialten prided herself on her composure. She had treated soldiers with plasma burns, miners with crushed thoraxes, and even once a diplomat who had attempted to ingest molten silver as a cultural bonding ritual. Nothing startled her. Nothing. Until she examined her first human. The patient lay on the bed, battered but stable, vitals humming along in reassuring patterns. Jialten's tendrils moved with clinical precision as she scanned for tissue damage. Then, without warning, the human's lower body exhibited movement, a swelling, an inflammation between the legs, unlike any normal trauma response recorded in the Vaithran medical databases. Jialten froze, all four eyes widening. Was this a hidden infection? A circulatory collapse? Some kind of spontaneous growth? She had studied 43 species in the galactic Concord, yet nothing prepared her for the peculiar biology and even stranger instincts of Homo sapiens. Nurse Jialten had long cultivated a reputation aboard the Vaithra for her absolute composure, the kind of calm steadiness that younger medics often aspired to but rarely achieved. In her years of service with the Galactic Concord's Medical Corps, she had seen situations spiral from routine injuries to battlefield emergencies in a matter of moments, and yet she never allowed panic to touch her. The concept of fear was acknowledged in her species. Yes, but Jialten treated it like an unnecessary reflex, one that she had disciplined out of herself. Her colleagues often remarked that she seemed almost machine-like in her focus, though the subtle warmth in her interactions reminded them she was flesh and thought, not circuitry and code. Pride, in the quiet professional sense, was what sustained her. Not arrogance, not the smugness of someone who thought themselves superior, but the inward certainty that her training and experience had forged her into something steady, something unshakable, something every patient could trust when everything else around them fell apart. The reputation was not accidental. From her earliest days as a trainee in the medical academies on Vaithra Prime, Jialten had learned that a medic who flinches is one who invites disaster. She remembered the first time she was asked to treat a Lorathi warrior after a skirmish on the frontier. The alien's skin had been flayed open in jagged rents, and the warrior's own regenerative enzymes were working overtime, boiling the tissue around the wound with hissing sounds and acrid smoke. The smell had been enough to make half her cohort gag. Jialten had simply adjusted her respirator, set her tools in motion, and worked as if the grotesque display were nothing more unusual than a small cut. The instructors had taken note. That moment became the seed of her growing identity, the nurse who could not be rattled, no matter how bizarre or severe the case might be. Over time, that identity solidified into her very core. On remote stations orbiting dying stars, she treated engineers who had been dosed with radiation that crystallized their blood. In the icy colonies on the rim, she handled cases of exposure so severe, the victim's extremities shattered when touched, requiring careful reattachment of frozen fragments like pieces of porcelain. On diplomatic vessels, she dealt with accidents involving exotic cuisines, such as the Avraxi dignitary who collapsed after accidentally ingesting raw hydrogen-laced fruit. Each time, Jialten faced the crisis with the same steady calm. She became the one others looked to when chaos threatened to overwhelm a medbay. She knew that reputation mattered, that others leaned on her composure as much as patients depended on her skill, and she took pride in that. What distinguished her wasn't just the external perception. Internally, Jialten measured herself against an ideal, She remembered what it had been like to be uncertain, to doubt herself in the early stages of her training, and she found satisfaction in knowing she had crossed that threshold. Now, whenever she entered a ward, she carried with her not only the medical instruments strapped across her chest and the databanks slotted into her neural interface, but also the knowledge that her calm presence itself could stabilize a situation. Patients looked into her four eyes and found reassurance, even when their bodies were failing them. Colleagues found a steady anchor in her tone, her movements, her refusal to break under pressure. That was worth more than all the accolades she had accumulated, though there had been many. Commendations for bravery, recognition from the Concord's Health Council, even a ceremonial ribbon from the Vathran High Matron herself. Still, Jiao-Ten never allowed those honors to cloud her focus. She thought of pride not as a trophy but as a discipline, something that had to be renewed daily. Every new patient was a test. Every case was an opportunity to prove once again that she was as composed as everyone believed her to be. She thrived on the unspoken challenge. Could anything shake her? Could any situation provoke a falter in her steady hands? So far, the answer had always been no. Plasma burns that charred the skin into black crusts, chemical inhalations that left beings coughing up their own dissolved tissue, genetic parasites that erupted in the most inconvenient of places. She had seen it all, and she had handled it all. Her tendrils never trembled, her voices never wavered, her focus never broke. This was who she was. That reputation was also armor. The galaxy was vast and chaotic, full of horrors that could paralyze even seasoned veterans. For many, the best protection was to cultivate an image of invincibility. For Jiao-Ten, the image wasn't a mask, but an extension of reality. She was invincible, at least in spirit. She didn't consider herself incapable of error. No medical practitioner could make that claim honestly, but she considered herself immune to shock. Nothing could surprise her anymore. Nothing could unnerve her. She had seen the worst the galaxy could throw into a medbay, and she had endured it all without flinching. She often reflected on that pride during the quiet hours between shifts, when the medbay lights dimmed and the hum of the frigate was the only sound in the air. She would review her past cases, recalling the variety of anatomies she had worked on, the sheer diversity of life she had encountered. 43 distinct species treated directly by her hands, and countless subspecies variations cataloged in her logs. Each one had challenged her knowledge and adaptability, forcing her to think on her feet, yet never had one managed to shake her composure. That was her standard, and she lived by it. She knew others envied that quality. Young recruits whispered about her as though she were a legend. Senior physicians respected her deeply, sometimes deferring to her judgment in the heat of crisis. Patients, when they were conscious enough, expressed gratitude not only for her skill but for the calm that radiated from her. Jiao-Ten accepted all of it with a quiet nod, never boasting, never allowing the recognition to become vanity. Pride, yes. Vanity, no. That distinction mattered, because pride could sharpen a medic, while vanity could dull one. Pride gave her strength. Vanity would only invite mistakes. She never confused the two. In truth, Jiao-Ten believed her pride was what kept her balanced in a galaxy where chaos was the rule. She was no warrior. She had never fired a plasma rifle or stood on the front lines of battle. Her strength came in the aftermath, in the ward, in the stillness of controlled urgency. That was her battlefield, and she considered herself undefeated. When others faltered, when fear spread like contagion, she remained steady. That steadiness was her weapon, her shield, her identity. To lose it would mean losing herself, and so she held it fiercely, tending to it with as much care as she did her patients. Her first encounter with human anatomy began long before the actual examination. In the corridors of the Vathra, she had overheard discussions among the crew about the new arrivals. Humans, they were called, recent entrants into the Concord. The name alone had a simplicity that intrigued her, lacking the layered inflections most species insisted on for their identities. The whispers among technicians and junior medics carried both fascination and unease. Humans were hardy, reckless, sometimes violent, yet also oddly adaptive. The few reports Jiao-Ten could access described them as a species whose physiology seemed almost contradictory. Soft and fragile in many respects, yet able to survive conditions that would incapacitate sturdier beings. Their bodies were described as inefficient by some analysts, wasteful of energy and prone to disease, but then praised by others as marvels of redundancy and resilience. She absorbed every bit of information she could, not because she expected to treat one, but because the mystery of a newly encountered biology always stirred her curiosity. When the day arrived, it did so with the unceremonious buzz of a medical request routed directly to her terminal. A human male, rescued from the wreckage of a cargo vessel that had strayed too close to a gravity well, was being brought aboard. He was injured but stable, unconscious from shock and exposure. Jalten read the sparse medical notes attached to the file and found them woefully inadequate. Heart rate patterns unlike anything familiar, oxygen demands startlingly high, fluid distribution in the body described as precariously balanced. The notes even included a warning: do not assume standard respiratory parameters. Humans exhibit alarming tolerance ranges. She found herself adjusting her expectations. Whatever this species was, it defied easy categorization. And for Jalten, that meant her skills would be tested in a way she had not experienced for some time. The patient arrived on a grav gurney, pale-skinned and wrapped in emergency film. His face was unremarkable at first glance: 2 eyes, bilateral symmetry, a mouth placed predictably where most species would have it. But there was something in the way the features arranged themselves that suggested alertness, even in unconsciousness. Humans, she remembered reading, communicated as much with expressions as with words, their faces acting like an ever-shifting display of thought. Even at rest, she sensed potential energy behind the closed lids and slack jaw. His chest rose and fell in steady rhythm, and she noted with faint astonishment the audible pull of air through the nasal passages. Many species breathed soundlessly. Humans apparently did not. The sound was both crude and oddly reassuring, like a machine working honestly at its task. Her first touch with the examination tendrils was a revelation. The skin was warmer than most species she had worked on, exuding a faint sheen of moisture that confused her sensors at first. She checked again, confirming that this was not blood or plasma loss, but a natural phenomenon: perspiration. An entire mechanism designed to regulate body heat by excreting fluid through the skin. Inefficient, she thought, but clever in its own primitive way. Beneath the skin, the musculature was denser than she expected, layered in fibrous bundles that seemed designed for both strength and endurance. The skeletal framework beneath felt rigid yet lightweight, supported by a structure of calcium rather than the flexible cartilaginous bases she was used to in aquatic or semi-fluid species. It was a body built for motion, for labor, for persistence. The circulatory system was her next focus, and here the human confounded her further. The central pump, the heart, was large compared to body mass, beating with a vigor that seemed excessive. She watched the rhythm on her instruments and was startled at how variable it was, quickening slightly with the smallest stimuli, slowing when the patient shifted unconsciously. Most species had predictable rhythms, unless under duress. The human heart behaved almost like a sensor in itself, responding to subtle changes in state. Red fluid blood carried oxygen through iron-based molecules, giving it a bright coloration she found strangely vivid compared to the duller hues of copper or cobalt-based systems. The efficiency was undeniable, though the reliance on such a reactive element as iron seemed dangerous. Yet it worked, and clearly worked well, for the body was thriving even after trauma. The respiratory system only deepened her fascination. Lungs, massive relative to chest cavity, expanding like bellows. She noted the redundancy of having two, when one might suffice, but then realized the survival advantage. Lose one, and the being might still live. That theme appeared everywhere in the anatomy. Paired organs, layered protections, multiple backups for functions most species would delegate to a single structure. It spoke of an evolutionary path through danger, a constant demand for survival under hostile conditions. She began to understand why some reports described humans as stubbornly unkillable. Their very design was a testament to persistence. Then came the nervous system, and here she felt a flicker of unease, for the density of neural pathways was staggering. The brain, encased in bone, showed patterns of activity even in unconsciousness, flickering with dreams or memories. She could not interpret them, of course, but her instruments told her enough. The human mind did not rest even when the body demanded it. It processed, calculated, simulated. It lived in layers of awareness that extended beyond the immediate physical state. and the peripheral nerves, spread like a vast web through the body, gave this being a sensitivity to touch and pain that was unusually high. Where many species evolved to dull pain for survival, humans appeared to embrace it, to experience it fully, perhaps as a guide or warning. Jiao marveled at the evolutionary gamble. To feel so much was dangerous, yet it could also drive adaptation faster than numbness ever would. She cataloged all of this with meticulous care, each note adding to the slowly forming picture of the species. Hardier than they appeared, redundant in structure, alive in a way that felt almost reckless. She could not help but feel a stir of admiration, though she checked herself quickly. Professionalism demanded distance, but even the most disciplined medic could recognize brilliance when it stared them in the face. And this human body was, in its own crude way, brilliant. When she reached the lower regions of the anatomy, she noted the reproductive organs with detached efficiency, duality again, redundancy again, though arranged in a way unlike any species she had previously examined. The structures were externalized rather than internal, exposed to potential harm, which struck her as biologically reckless. She wondered at the evolutionary pathway that led to such vulnerability. Yet the data suggested it worked, for the species was thriving and spreading. She recorded the details without judgment, though a flicker of curiosity pressed at her thoughts. There was something about the way the body responded in that region, a complexity of tissue and circulation she could not yet map fully, that hinted at functions beyond the obvious. She reminded herself that speculation had no place here, but she made a mental note to revisit the question when more data became available. Throughout the examination, she remained aware of her own reactions. This was not just another patient, not just another species. This was an encounter with something that challenged her assumptions about life itself. Her composure held, as it always did, but beneath the surface she felt the stirrings of a new kind of professional excitement. Humans, she realized, were not merely another entry in the endless catalog of galactic biology. They were something else entirely, something that refused to fit neatly into categories or expectations. And this was only the beginning of what she would learn. The unexpected swelling began with such subtlety that Jiao almost missed it. Her tendrils were scanning the lower abdomen, cataloging organ placement and vascular branching, when a shift in tissue density alerted her sensors. At first, she assumed it was a post-traumatic edema, perhaps localized swelling from blunt force during the cargo vessel crash. Injuries often manifested in odd ways, and she had documented cases where impact trauma caused delayed expansions of tissue pockets. Yet as she adjusted her instruments and recalibrated the readings, she realized this change was not consistent with any pathology in her database. The tissue was firming, vascular activity spiking sharply, and circulation in the immediate region intensified with alarming speed. She froze, her four eyes narrowing as she watched the swelling grow in real time. For a species whose biology was already puzzling enough, this was the first event that truly threatened to disrupt her professional composure. She extended another probe to measure temperature variation. The localized rise was significant, far beyond what she would expect for passive inflammation. Blood flow had redirected toward the region with deliberate urgency, as though the body itself were intentionally diverting resources. This was no accident of injury, no random failure of systems. It was a controlled response, triggered by some internal mechanism she had not yet identified. Her mind raced to recall every briefing, every fragment of data on humans. Nothing in the training modules had prepared her for this. Not a single note, not a single warning in the meager human physiology files. She rechecked her assumptions. Was this an infection, some kind of pathogenic invasion localized to this area? Was it a circulatory malfunction? Or worse, was this a form of hemorrhage, a dangerous pooling of blood that could spiral into systemic collapse? Her instinct was to stabilize, to intervene, but without context, intervention could be disastrous. She held back, tendrils hovering above the region, waiting. The gurney sensors confirmed her findings. Heart rate had increased slightly, blood pressure elevated, respiration unchanged. The rest of the body seemed unconcerned, as though this sudden vascular surge was entirely normal. Jiao struggled with the contradiction. Normal physiology did not behave this way under stress. A localized event of such magnitude should have sent warning signals throughout the system, activating pain receptors, triggering adrenal responses. Yet the human's neural activity, though spiking faintly in dream patterns, did not register distress. There was no pain reflex, no systemic alarm. Instead, the body lay calm, unconscious, while this one region acted out a drama of its own. She felt a ripple of unease press against her pride and composure. For the first time in many cycles, she was observing something she could not explain, and that reality unsettled her more than the swelling itself. Her mind sought analogs among other species. The Draxiri had expansion sacs that inflated under environmental stress to protect vital organs, but those were symmetrical and predictable, not isolated in a single reproductive region. The Evrons displayed reflexive glandular growths when threatened, but those secreted defensive toxins, and the tissues behaved nothing like this. None of her 43 treated species offered a parallel. The closest comparison she could summon were emergency vascular surges in regenerative organisms, where the body directed resources toward repair. Yet here there was no visible injury to mend, no trauma in the immediate vicinity. The swelling was not repair, it was transformation. Transformation into what she had no idea. She leaned closer, letting her secondary eyes adjust focus. The surface texture shifted slightly, as though responding to internal pressure. Vessels beneath expanded visibly, pushing against skin already tight with engorgement. It was almost as if the organ itself were awakening, preparing for some unknown function. The longer she observed, the more deliberate it appeared. This was not failure, not breakdown. It was activation. But activation of what? Her databanks remained silent. Not a single alert, not a single explanation. For the first time in years, she felt her certainty fracture. Her composure remained intact outwardly, her hands steady, her breathing slow, but inside her thoughts churned in agitation. What was she witnessing? The other medics in the bay had not noticed. They busied themselves with routine post-trauma checks, unaware of the anomaly unfolding on her gurney. Jaltin debated summoning assistance, but stopped herself. To admit she did not understand would be to expose weakness, to crack the image of composure she had cultivated for so long. She was not ready to do that. Instead, she continued her private examination, recording every data point with exhaustive precision. Vascular dilation, 83% above baseline. Tissue firmness, doubling within minutes. Temperature, rising steadily. Neural activity and proximity, heightened but not signaling distress. The data painted a picture she could not yet interpret, a puzzle missing its central piece. She cursed, silently and inwardly, the inadequacy of the Concord's human physiology files. How could they have overlooked this? How could they fail to prepare her for something so dramatic? A faint twitch from the patient startled her. One leg shifted slightly, an unconscious reflex. She froze, tendrils held motionless. Was the human waking? The eyelids fluttered but did not open. The twitch subsided, leaving her alone again with the swelling that showed no sign of halting. If anything, it intensified, growing until she questioned the structural limits of the skin. Surely this could not be safe. Surely rupture was imminent. And yet, the body betrayed no alarm. The paradox gnawed at her. Every instinct told her to act, to intervene, but professional caution restrained her. Until she knew what she was facing, to interfere could cause more harm than good. Her mind, usually so sharp, stumbled over possibilities. Could this be a unique survival reflex of humans? Some hidden adaptation that allowed them to repel predators, perhaps through intimidation? Could it be a metabolic storage function, redirecting resources into temporary reservoirs? Or was it reproductive in nature, some kind of readiness response triggered by stimuli she did not perceive? The last thought unsettled her most. If it were reproductive, it implied this unconscious patient was responding not to injury but to environment, and she, standing there with her tendrils upon him, was part of that environment. The realization made her shift uncomfortably, though her movements betrayed nothing outwardly. Minutes stretched, her focus locked on the anomaly. She had faced burning tissue, crystallized blood, even parasites erupting mid-procedure, and none of those had tested her composure like this silent, inexplicable swelling. It was not grotesque, not horrifying in the way battlefield injuries were, but it was unnerving because it carried no logic she understood. The body was performing a function outside her framework of knowledge, and she could not reconcile it. That gap in understanding was the true threat, more destabilizing than any wound. She prided herself on mastery, on control, yet here control slipped like sand between her tendrils. Every new pulse of the swelling felt like a challenge to her pride, every heartbeat a reminder of her ignorance. She kept her instruments steady, kept her gaze fixed, documenting with meticulous care. But inside, something shifted. This was no ordinary case. This was not just another patient. This was an encounter with the limits of her knowledge, with the strange and unpredictable biology of a species she had underestimated. She could not deny the truth pressing against her composure. She was shocked, though she would never allow the word to pass her lips. The medical database remained stubbornly silent. GL-10 had cross-referenced the swelling with every entry under human physiology, trauma responses, vascular anomalies, and even rare infections cataloged by the Concord. Not a single match appeared. Her neural interface cycled through comparative charts, overlaying data from 43 species she had studied, and still the human anomaly refused to align with anything recognizable. The absence of an entry was more disturbing than any alarming result could have been. Databases were supposed to anchor her, to transform the strange into the understandable, yet now they betrayed her by offering nothing but blank space where an explanation should be. She scrolled through again, triple-checking, convinced she must have overlooked some obscure footnote or half-translated field report, but the result remained the same, no record of such a response. Her pride and composure strained under the weight of that realization. She had encountered rare conditions before, but always there had been a foundation, some precedent buried in the archives. The medics of the Concord prided themselves on centuries of accumulated knowledge, each new discovery meticulously logged so that no one need face the unknown unprepared. To confront a gap this large in a species newly admitted to the Concord's fold was more than inconvenient, it was dangerous. If she acted without guidance, she risked harming the patient. If she hesitated too long, she risked letting a preventable crisis unfold. The human swelling might be harmless, a trivial reflex, or it might be the precursor to catastrophic organ failure. She could not know, and the database refused to help her know. Her mind turned to the bureaucratic reality of human integration into the Concord. Their entry had been hasty, spurred by political considerations rather than careful study. The species had proven unexpectedly valuable in frontier skirmishes, resilient fighters who survived conditions that felled others. They had demonstrated adaptability in trade, culture, and diplomacy. But the rush to welcome them had left gaps, especially in medical research. Too few samples, too little time, and too much reliance on human self-reports of their own biology. GL-10 now realized how insufficient those reports were. Humans themselves, it seemed, had neglected to disclose, or perhaps even to fully understand aspects of their own physiology. That negligence now left her adrift, watching a patient's body perform a transformation she could not explain. She tried to reason through the physiology with what she had observed so far. Blood redirected with urgency, skin stretched to accommodate, temperature elevated in a controlled range. Nothing about it suggested breakdown or disease. It was coordinated, purposeful. But purposeful toward what? The lack of database entries forced her to rely on instinct, a tool she mistrusted. Instinct was for soldiers and explorers. Medics required knowledge, certainty, and yet here she was, forced into speculation. Her tendrils hovered above the swelling, as if they might divine an answer from the surface alone. She ran another scan, this time pushing the limits of her instruments, probing for microvascular ruptures or hidden infections. The readings came back clean. No rupture, no fluid leakage, no tissue necrosis. By every measure she could take, the tissue was healthy, healthier even than the rest of the body recovering from trauma. That paradox unsettled her more than anything else. Trauma patients did not exhibit sudden surges of vitality in isolated regions. They conserved, they collapsed, they shut down functions to protect the core. Yet this human's body had decided to pour resources into an area utterly irrelevant to immediate survival. It defied the very logic of triage biology. The database would have told her if this was an adaptive survival reflex, but it remained blank. Blank space was the enemy, a void that mocked her with its silence. She felt a flicker of frustration pierce her professionalism, a dangerous emotion in the sterile calm of the medbay. She pressed it down, breathing slowly. But the thought gnawed at her. How could the Concord admit a species into its fold without understanding them? How could they risk lives, both human and alien, by leaving their biology half-charted? She imagined the consequences spreading outward from this one gurney. What if another medic encountered the same phenomenon and mistook it for a crisis? What if invasive intervention damaged the human instead of helping? What if in combat situations, medics misinterpreted this swelling and wasted precious seconds addressing a non-threat while real injuries worsened? The gaps in the database were not just academic oversights, they were threats to survival. She felt the weight of responsibility pressing on her. She was here, now, faced with the anomaly. If she could not find an explanation, then perhaps it was her duty to create one, to observe, to document, to fill in the blank space. The database had failed her, but she could correct the failure for those who came after. Her instruments continued their quiet hum, recording every measurable fluctuation. She opened a separate log, an unsanctioned one, her private record. If the Concord's files were inadequate, she would build her own. She detailed every change in volume, every vascular shift, every faint twitch of surrounding musculature. She even noted the way the skin tones shifted slightly, a deepening of color that suggested increased perfusion. The details piled into the log, but they remained only data, without meaning. She yearned for meaning, for the single line in a database entry that would label this as benign or critical, normal or pathological. But no such line existed, so she forced herself to resist the temptation to conclude prematurely. Observation first, interpretation later. The silence of the database became a kind of presence in the room. It loomed in her thoughts, a reminder that for all her training and all her experience, she was walking blind. Her colleagues still had not noticed. She could call them over, share the burden of uncertainty, but pride held her back. If the database had no answers, then someone must find them through skill, not committee. She needed to prove that she could face the unknown and still maintain her composure. Her reputation was built on steadiness, and steadiness was most valuable when confronted with mystery. Even as doubt clawed at her, she forced her tendrils to move with their usual deliberate grace, as if she were in complete control. She could almost hear the database mocking her with its emptiness. Rows of neatly cataloged information on other species scrolled past her inner vision, each entry rich with detail, each condition mapped and explained, but the human file was a hollow frame, skeleton notes without substance. She thought of the future, of the inevitable influx of humans into conquered stations and ships, of the countless medics who would confront bodies like this one. If no one filled the blanks, the consequences could be catastrophic. Perhaps she was the first to face this exact situation. Perhaps this was history unfolding not in grand battles or political councils, but here, in the quiet tension of a medbay, in the swelling of tissue that no database could explain. The patient shifted again, a faint murmur escaping his lips, and she felt the urgency sharpen. Time was pressing forward, and with it the responsibility to act, to decide, to interpret, without the safety net of precedent. The database would not save her, and no record would whisper reassurance in her ear. She was alone with the anomaly, alone with her pride, alone with the realization that even the great Concorde could not prepare her for everything the galaxy had to offer. Protocol dictated that she record, stabilize, and report anomalies immediately. Yet Gial-10 found herself hesitating. The swelling between the human's legs continued in its inexplicable progression, not collapsing into failure nor escalating into crisis, simply persisting with a confidence that seemed to mock her uncertainty. She ran another scan, then a third, as though repetition could transform ignorance into clarity. But the results were always the same. No sign of pathology, no indication of imminent rupture, only healthy tissue behaving in a way no database could predict. The rules pressed at her from within: submit findings, call in senior staff, escalate to Concord authorities. But another force pressed back with equal strength: her curiosity. The weight of professionalism battled with the undeniable pull to understand, to solve the puzzle before her. Her tendrils flexed with restrained motion as she cycled through options. If she reported now, the anomaly would become the property of committees, dissected by bureaucrats who would reduce her discovery into sterile memos. Worse, she would admit she had been startled, that her composure had cracked for even a moment. That would stain the reputation she had built across countless assignments. Colleagues would whisper that GL10, the unshakable, had finally been shaken by a simple swelling. The thought tightened her chest in ways no battlefield gore ever had. She could not allow that. She had to maintain the image of unbroken steadiness, even if inside her mind the storm of questions raged uncontrolled. So she lingered, balancing on the thin line between protocol and curiosity. Her instruments captured metrics in obsessive detail, minute fluctuations in circumference, subtle changes in firmness, faint tremors in the vascular surge. She should have flagged it, should have summoned a physician with broader authority, but instead she whispered silent justifications to herself. This was observation, she reasoned, not delay. A medic could not draw conclusions without sufficient data. Her duty was to the patient, and premature escalation might cause harm if those above her misinterpreted the readings. She convinced herself she was protecting the human by holding the anomaly in her own hands for a while longer. Yet beneath those rationalizations, curiosity pulsed stronger. She wanted to know. The drive was not selfish, not entirely, but it was undeniably personal. To be the first to map an uncharted corner of human physiology, to transform the blank space of the database into a living record, such an opportunity was rare. Most medics lived and died practicing within the well-defined borders of known biology. She had been granted the chance to step beyond, to look into the unknown and return with answers. That temptation was intoxicating. She told herself again that it was for the Concord, for medicine, for the safety of future patients, but in truth there was a part of her that yearned for discovery in its rawest form. Her composure became a mask stretched tight. Outwardly she worked with the same calm movements, tendrils drifting gracefully, instruments humming softly. If any colleague glanced her way, they would see only the professional nurse at her duties, untroubled by the oddities of another alien body. Inwardly, though, every second was a battle. Curiosity urged her to prod, to stimulate the tissues further, to see if the swelling had limits or hidden stages. Protocol reminded her that unsanctioned interference could be malpractice, an ethical violation with consequences for both her career and the patient's safety. She gripped the tension like a rope stretched between her hands, neither releasing curiosity nor surrendering to protocol, simply holding on while the moment lengthened. The human stirred again, a faint twitch of limbs, another murmur in the strange guttural sounds of their language. She froze, fearing consciousness might end her opportunity. If he awoke, she would have to retreat to strict procedure, ask questions, document with transparency, perhaps even apologize for the invasive scans. But the human settled again, sinking deeper into unconscious recovery. Relief washed over her, followed by guilt that she felt relief at a patient's continued vulnerability. She reminded herself that her work was for his benefit, that understanding his body could mean the difference between life and death for humans in future crises. Still, the guilt lingered, mingled with the burning itch of unanswered questions. She thought back to her training, to the words of her instructors, "Composure is the shield of the healer." She had lived by that creed, but never had composure demanded so much restraint. In combat zones, she had endured the sight of torn flesh and boiling enzymes without flinching. But those were horrors she could catalog, horrors the database confirmed and explained. Here, the horror was absence, the absence of knowledge, the abyss of not knowing. And against that abyss, curiosity rose like a tide, pulling her toward it. If she let curiosity take her, would she fall? Or would she discover something worth the risk? Her internal dialogue circled endlessly. Document and report, observe and delay, protect reputation, pursue knowledge. She imagined herself on trial before Concord officials, accused of recklessness. She imagined herself celebrated in future manuals as the first to record the hidden reflex of human anatomy. The two visions warred within her, neither yielding. She stared at the swelling as if it might provide the answer, as if the tissue itself might whisper its purpose into her mind. But it remained silent, pulsing with its own internal rhythm, indifferent to her turmoil. Time in the med bay slowed, each tick of the ship's chronometer stretching into agonizing length. Her instruments recorded faithfully, but instruments could not decide for her. She alone bore the responsibility. Her tendrils hovered again, trembling faintly despite her effort to still them. She wanted to press, to test, to know. But professionalism demanded distance. The conflict was unbearable, yet she held it, refusing to yield fully to either side. This was the essence of her pride, the ability to balance on the razor's edge, neither collapsing into recklessness nor surrendering to fear. Still, she could feel the edge cutting her, feel the strain in every fiber of her being. What unsettled her most was the realization that she cared, not only about the patient's survival, but about the mystery itself. The swelling had become more than a medical anomaly. It was a symbol of everything humans represented: unpredictability, vitality, refusal to conform to established patterns. Her curiosity about the swelling mirrored the galaxy's curiosity about humans as a species. Protocol demanded they be cataloged and controlled. Curiosity whispered that they might change everything. She was caught between those forces, as surely as the Concorde itself was caught between welcoming humans and fearing what they might bring. Her mask of composure remained, unbroken to any outside eye. But within, the struggle deepened. She could neither banish curiosity nor silence protocol, so she lived suspended between them, every thought sharpened to a point of tension. The swelling continued its silent defiance, and she continued her silent battle, a nurse torn between duty and discovery, between the rules she had sworn to uphold and the mystery that called to her with irresistible force.